Thank you very much for the warm welcome. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £19, 19 and 6. Result, happiness. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £20, 0 and 6. Result, misery. So what's the nature of this misery? The misery Mr. Micawber mentions in David Copperfield is imprisonment for debt. We will look this evening at some of Charles Dickens' fictionalised accounts of life in debtors' prisons, particularly the Marshalsea, which features in Little Dorrit, and the Fleet Prison, which is in the Pickwick Papers. There will be a particular focus on Charles Dickens' father John, who was imprisoned for debt. Some of the questions we'll consider will be why people were imprisoned for debt, what was life like in a debtor's prison, and how debtors were able to obtain their freedom. Now, I decided tonight I'd be a bit different. I would come along and wear clothes from the 1820s, okay? Some of the items I'm wearing, the waistcoat's the original one from the period, okay? The dress coat was made about 1900 for the theatre, but it's spot on for the 1820s. I've got front full trousers. If gentlemen are that interested in them, there's no zip, okay? Front full, nice and easy to use. I'm not going to put the top hat on, but a typical top hat of the period. It's a mid-19th century top hat. John Dickens, Charles' father, was very, very close conscious, and he portrayed himself as a gentleman of some considerable standing, somewhat above his financial means. According to Charles Dickens, his father was as kind-hearted and as generous a man as ever lived in the world. He was sociable to a fault and meticulous in his discharging an employer's obligations. But he had been bred to expect much from a world where his talents and social standing delivered far less. And the gulf between what he wished for and what he could afford could only be bridged at the expense of others. To those tradesmen and friends and relatives from whom he borrowed, he displayed a streak of unscrupulous disregard that undermined the generosity of which his son spoke. It would bring him through the gates of the Marshalsea prison in February 1824. John Dickens was born in 1785, the second son of two upper servants. His father was a butler and his mother was a housekeeper to the very well-to-do Crewe family of Crewe Hall in Cheshire. The family provided John with a sound education and probably helped him embark on his career in the Navy Pay Office. In 1805, he was employed as a temporary clerk at Somerset House. By 1807, he was on the permanent staff as a 15th assistant clerk in the Navy Pay Office. 2 years later, he married Elizabeth Barrow, the sister of a fellow clerk. He had moved to Portsmouth by now, the Portsmouth office, and he had a salary of £200, which was quite significant in those days. In 1810, the Dickenses began what would be a large family with the birth of Fanny. She was followed by Charles in 1812, Letitia in 1816, Frederick in 1820, Alfred in 1822, and Augustus in 1827. Although his salary had doubled by 1820, the demands of a growing family and the need to keep up the appearance of a gentleman of some substance outpaced his income. Bills of every kind were run up till payday and then not paid. You were paid in those days every quarter. Then there was a disastrous shift in John Dickens' fortunes in 1822. He'd been in Chatham, he was summoned back to London, but his salary was cut by more than a fifth. He couldn't manage on what it was previously, but certainly couldn't manage on it when it was cut by more than a fifth. The family had to rent a cheap house in Camden Town. John was not able to adjust to his reduced circumstances, unfortunately. Debts mounted. He owed money to various people, including a large sum in those days of £40 to James Carr, a baker. It was a tremendous sum, approximately 1/10 of his annual income. Carr swore an affidavit to show that Dickens owed him £10 and upwards, and that he had him arrested on what was called a Marshalsea writ. And we have here a copy or a photocopy of the writ where he was, hold on here, John Dickens, James Carr, £40, 10 shillings is what he owed this baker. A lot of bread the family must have eaten to racked up that debt. So this is a copy of the admission register from the Marshalsea prison for the 20th of February 1824. And on that day, John Dickens was imprisoned in the Marshalsea debtors' prison under the Insolvent Debtors Act of 1813, owing Carr £40 and 10 shillings. Now, this is the new Marshalsea prison here, it's an illustration, in Southwark, where John Dickens was imprisoned, as was William Dorrit in Little Dorrit. The new Marshalsea prison was actually not an old, decrepit building. It was 12 years old when Dickens was in prison there. The old one had been closed in 1811. The new prison stood off Borough High Street, a short distance from the old prison buildings. I've got a map here just to give you an idea from... There it is, and it's a plan of the prison. We'll have a look at more detail in a moment. And it's essentially a block. See here is a block of houses. And in those houses there were 56 rooms. And each room is about 11 by 11 feet. So 11 feet square. One window, so no full ventilation at all. You can imagine the stench within those rooms. And it was made worse because the privies. There were 3 privies, and they are D. There were 2 men's privies and 1 privy for ladies and children. And it was unbelievable, the smell from those privies. And there were lots of complaints about them. Now, the first glimpse we have of John Dickens in the Marshalsea is through the eyes of his sharp 12-year-old son. And this is what he wrote later. He wrote, "My father was waiting for me in the lodge, and we went into his room and cried very much. And he told me, I remember, to take warning by the Marshalsea, and to observe that if a man had £20 a year and spent £19, 19 shillings and sixpence, he would be happy. But that a shilling spent the other way would make him wretched." I can still see the fire we sat before now, with 2 bricks inside the rusted grate, 1 on each side to prevent it burning too many coals. Some other debtor shared the room with him, who came in by and by. In April 1824, Dickens managed to procure a single room, and his wife Elizabeth, along with Letitia, Harriet, Frederick and Alfred, moved out of their rented accommodation, number 4 Gower Street, North, into John's small room. The eldest daughter, Fanny, didn't come with them because she was actually a pupil at the Royal School of College of Music, where she was doing extremely well. Charles Dickens didn't live there either. He had to leave school, and he had to work, as you probably know, in the blacking factory, 10 hours a day for 6 shillings a week. And he had a room in Little College Street, Camden Town, the other side, north of the river. But he would come across the river to the Marshalsea, and he would have his breakfast very often and his supper, and he would spend his weekends with his parents in their cramped room. His father's income ensured that the family were well provided for in prison. In fact, they were better provided for in prison than they were out of it. They even had their maid of work, who lived in the vicinity, to come in and work for them. So it was really lovely. What they didn't have was people constantly harassing them to pay the bills. They owed so much. So they're quite secure in prison in a way, despite the fact the room was very cramped. Now, if you've read any of Dickens' books, you probably know that prison is a major theme in them. I've got here an early copy of Charles Dickens' Little Dorrit. Now, this one focuses on the Marshalsea. All the other books he wrote, and I'll explain them in a minute, it's really about the Marshalsea, because this is what Dickens knew from a child. And his accounts of the King's Bench and the Fleet Prison, it's all going back his memories of as a child when his father was in the Marshalsea. So, if you read the early works, sketches by Boz, 1836 to 7, there is a description of the condemned cell in Newgate, very much like some of the cells in the Marshalsea. His final unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, 1870, has a scene in the condemned cell as well. And in between, he describes the burning of Newgate in Barnaby Rudge, 1841. Fagin's last night in the condemned cells and the storming of the Bastille in A Tale of Two Cities, 1859. But it's not just imprisons, it's imprisonment for debt, which is a really strong feature, a recurring theme in his writing. In his first novel, Pickwick Papers, 1836, Mr. Pickwick is a defendant in an action for breach of promise of marriage brought by his landlady, Mrs. Bardell. She had misunderstood Mr. Pickwick's announcement that he was going to employ a servant and believed he was offering her his hand in marriage. So she took him to court. Pickwick lost the case. He believed he'd suffered a great miscarriage of justice and refused to pay the damages awarded and the costs. As a result, he was sent to Fleet Prison. Here we have him in the Fleet Prison watching the antics of the other prisoners, etc. In David Copperfield, Mr. Micawber, another representation of Dickens' father John, is imprisoned in the King's Bench. Little Dorrit, published like all the books were in serial form, 1855-7, is a much more ambitious novel. Amy Dorrit was born in the Marshalsea, and all the characters in the novel live under the shadow of debt and imprisonment, including her friend Maggie, here in this illustration. Dickens was so deeply affected by his father's disgrace that it had a profound psychological impact upon him. So much so that he could not even bring himself to visit the Marshalsea prison until after he'd finished Little Dorrit and after his father had died. Imprisonment for debt goes back to the 13th century, when the Crown had the right to incarcerate people who owed them money. And individuals used that from the 13th century onwards, the Crown's right to imprison. They could use it themselves to imprison people who owed them money. This wasn't a very sensible thing to do, because if you owed somebody money and he put you in prison, what do you lose? You lose your job and you can't pay your debts. So, question for all of you today. Why do you think, what were the reasons for putting people in prison if they couldn't pay their debts? Anyone any ideas? Why?
Excuse to hang them.
Hang them! Yes, well, they could have done that, but that was one of the reasons, perhaps. Any other ideas?
I suppose in some cases they might have thought that they or their relatives or family may come up with the money to get them out of prison.
Splendid, that's one of the very good reasons. Yes, any other reasons?
To stop them spending more and increasing their debt.
Yes.
They're locked up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Revenge.
Revenge, malice. Malice was probably the number one reason why the creditors wanted to they took revenge on their debtors. That was definitely. And there was one other reason.
Stop them running off.
Yeah, stop them running off. We know where you are if in prison.
Warning to others.
Deterrence.
Warning to others.
Warning to others, maybe. One of the reasons was what was known as first mover advantage. So often debtors, they owe money to several people. Now, if you brought that prosecution against that debtor, you had sort of much greater chance of being paid than the other debtors. That was the idea. So you might get your money, the other people lower down the list might not. So first mover advantage was one of the reasons why they brought a Marshalsea writ against the person who owed the money. But I think, as you've said, the most significant reason was they wanted to ensure that friends and relatives would cough up, open their wallets, and have the debt paid, so their son, their wife, their parents perhaps wouldn't want the humiliation of a relative being incarcerated in a prison, and they would make sure the debt was paid. Now, what was the process involved with all of this? So it would start by what Dickens describes in his writings. He says, to start with, a creditor swore an affidavit before a court claiming that he or she was owed money. And the court would issue a writ which instructed the sheriff to arrest the defendant and keep him safely so that he would appear in court on a certain day to satisfy the plaintiff. The normal process was for the debtor to be arrested by a bailiff or a sheriff's officer, and then taken to a place called a sponging house, usually the officer's own house. So why was it called a sponging house? Anyone any idea? Go on, can you add a bit more to it? You're on the right lines. You're doing very well.
So they can torture him pricking for the money.
Oh, they might have tried that. It was really, the idea was, it was like a sponge. You would try to squeeze that person, metaphorically, to encourage, in the sponging house, the relatives to cough up that money so he didn't end up, or she end up, going to debtor's prison. And also, there was the money had to go to the bailiff who ran it. So he had a share of any money which they squeezed out of the relatives or friends, because all along the line people's palms are being greased. Young Charles, in February 1824, before his father went into prison when he was in the sponging house, was sent all over London to try to get enough money to pay this debt of £40, 10 shillings, but to no avail. Dickens describes the process in Pickwick Papers as well. Mr. Pickwick is summoned from his bed by Namby, the sheriff's officer, and taken to a house in Coleman Street. The coach, having turned into a very narrow and dark street, stopped before a house with iron bars on all the windows, the doorposts of which were graced with the name and title of Namby, officer to the sheriffs of London. The inner gate, having been opened by a gentleman who was endowed with a large key for the purpose. Mr. Pickwick was shown into the coffee room. The coffee room was the front parlour, the principal features of which were fresh sand and stale tobacco smoke. The normal practice was for people to stay for a few days in a sponging house to see if they could possibly raise the money and get out of trouble. Pickwick spent less than a day there, being determined not to pay his debts, and after some discussion with his lawyer, he set off to the Fleet Prison. Imprisonment for debt was originally very different from bankruptcy. Bankruptcy was intended to deal with the normal upheavals of trade, so the law recognised that merchants ran certain risks. Ships would sink, warehouses would burn down, trading partners would default. Bankruptcy gave merchants a way of dealing with these crises by making all their assets available to their creditors and going through a court process. A trader could get a clean break and start again. So bankruptcy was restricted to traders who had large sums of money, not to people like John Dickens, who owed smaller amounts. Imprisonment for debt was a much cruder mechanism to force smaller debtors to pay up. People who owed as little as £2 could be imprisoned for debt as late as 1827. So if you owed £2, you could be put in prison. During Dickens' lifetime, the two legal processes came closer together. This began in 1813, when the Court for the Relief of Insolvent Debtors was established. The court allowed debtors to petition to be released on condition they handed over all their assets to the court and made any future income assets subject to its jurisdiction. The court appointed a provisional assignee to control the property and a broker to value it. The court's processes were complex and expensive. It cost about £10 to go through the procedure, again a lot of money in those days. The court was a success in that it provided a way out of prison for people who otherwise would have had no escape. But it really wasn't successful in recovering all the money which people owed. In fact, in 1840 it was estimated that only about 5% of cases was a dividend paid at all to those who had money owed to them, which was a very small percentage. There was, of course, deliberate fraud. Some people deliberately hid their assets, so it couldn't be ascertained how much money they actually had. So there were issues all along the way. Now, until Dickens' day, many debtors were kept in ordinary criminal prisons. They were held in Newgate until 1815, when the City of London opened the new debtors' prison at Whitecross Street. Most debtors were housed in specialist debtors' prisons, like the Fleet, which was at the bottom of Farringdon Road. And there were two south of the river. The King's Bench, which was located in an area of dark, reclaimed marshland close to St George's at Newington, Southwark, and of course the Marshalsea in the borough. What is surprising is that these debtors' prisons weren't terrible medieval relics full of dungeons and clanking chains and cobwebs. They may well have had cobwebs, but they were actually fairly recently built. They were modern buildings in Dickens' time, not ancient relics. Debtors, of course, weren't criminals. That's a really important number. They weren't criminals. They were imprisoned for purely civil offences. Consequently, they were treated rather leniently. As Mr. Pickwick discovered, money was, in the Fleet prison, just what money was out of it, and that it could instantly procure him almost anything he desired. Many prisoners, in fact, carried out their normal trades inside debtors' prisons. Some provided services to inmates, catering or laundry. Some ran sporting facilities. The rackets court in the Fleet prison was let out to prisoners who charged for its use. So what was life really like in a debtor's prison? There are examples in the 18th century of very cruel treatments, beatings and use of manacles, things that improved by Dickens' time. Most prisons had two sides to them, the master side and the common side, or the poor side. Common side prisoners were those without means, who had free accommodation in the prison and were eligible for a statutory payment of 3 shillings and 6pence a week, as well as charity payments. There were a lot of charities around then who did help these poor prisoners. Dickens tells us there used to be a kind of iron cage in the Fleet prison, just on the wall there, which was, they had a man of very hungry means and looks who was there, and from time to time he rattled a box and exclaimed in a mournful voice, "Pray remember the poor debtors, pray remember the poor debtors." How well he did, I really don't know, but obviously some people did give him some money. The master side of the prison was far larger. Although life for the occupants of these rooms wasn't luxurious, it did offer its comforts. The King's Bench, Fleet and Marshalsea all had tap rooms where you could buy wine, where you could buy beer, while the King's Bench had a coffee house and a bakehouse. In 1776, a visitor to the Fleet described how prisoners played at fives, skittles and tennis, and were often joined in the games by the porters of the nearby Smithfield Market. So their week might be like this. On Monday night, they had a wine club. All right, Monday night's the wine club. Tuesday night was a beer club. And then Wednesday night might be the new Sheridan Club. Or it might be when you go and play rackets. Mr. Micawber, who was in prison in the King's Bench, was seen to play a lively game of skittles one night, or more than one night, to exercise himself. There was a very interesting practice in these prisons of letting out rooms to the prisoners, and it was part of the regime which existed in all prisons up to Dickens' time. Not just debtors' prisons, but criminal prisons as well, where the staff, up to 1815, didn't get salaries at all. After 1815, they were beginning to be paid, but they still got extra money from elsewhere, as you'll see. So staff earned their income before 1815 by providing services to the prisoners. The turnkey, Mr. Roker, rented to Mr. Pickwick a carpet, 6 chairs, a table, a sofa, a bedspread, a kettle, and various other small articles at a very reasonable rate of 27 shillings and 6pence a week. Prisoners had to pay fees on admission and discharge, as well as room rents, and these went to the official in charge of the prison, either called the marshal or the master. And in many cases, prisoners were kept in jail not because they couldn't meet their debts, but because the debts they'd incurred in prison to pay for their fees and lodgings hadn't been met. So you get more debts run up in prison. As well as fees, the Marshal of the King's Bench received a share of profits from the sale of beer and the rent of the coffee house and the bakery. And in 1815, the Marshal of the King's Bench was making a profit of £3,500 a year.
Hooray!
The bulk of this income came from selling the right to reside outside the prison in what's called the Rules, an area of 3 square miles beyond the prison. 3,500 a year is at least 200,000 in today's money. The Parliamentary Commissioners of 1815 described the situation in the Fleet. They talked about the nominal head was a man called John Iles. He had been appointed not 10 years before, not 20 years before, but in 1759 he had been appointed to his job. By 1815 he was an old man, and he hadn't visited the prison since 1804. 1804 he'd last been in the prison. And of course, what he did, his deputy ran the prison for him with a salary, and his deputy ran it, and Iles had £500 a year. The deputy had the rest, which was really, who's called Mr. Nixon, he had £2,600 a year from the fees paid by prisoners plus the profits from the tap room. Out of this, he paid £10 for a clerk, Mr. Woodruff, who also got a fee of half a guinea for each person allowed to live within the rules. Nixon employed 3 turnkeys at a half guinea a week each. They also got a free room. He employed a man called Pryor, who was the scavenger and night watchman. He also paid a salary of £10 a year to an old man who was a prisoner and acted as a clerk. He paid a chaplain £30 a year. He also had to pay costs and legal expenses when a prisoner escaped. His net income was £1,800 a year, over £100,000 in modern money, plus, of course, free accommodation. You mustn't forget that, really important. One of the curious features of debtors' prisoners was the practice known as chummage. Chummage is described by Dickens in the Pickwick Papers. It goes like this. Accommodation, said the gentleman consulting a large book. Plenty of that, Mr. Pickwick. Your chummage ticket will be 27 in the third. Oh, said Mr. Pickwick. My what did you say? Your chummage ticket, replied Mr. Roker. You're up for that? Not quite, replied Mr. Pickwick with a smile. Why, said Mr. Roker, it's as plain as Salisbury. You'll have a chummage ticket upon 27 in the third, and them as is in the room will be your chums. Are there many of them? Inquired Mr. Pickwick dubiously. 3, replied Mr. Roker. Mr. Pickwick coughed. One of them's a parson, replied Mr. Roker, filling up a little piece of paper as he spoke. Another's a butcher. Oh, exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. A butcher, repeated Mr. Roker, giving his nib of his pen a tap on the desk to cure his disinclination to work and mark. So the theory was that all the rooms in the prison were full and occupied by one person. The next person to arrive as a prisoner would be directed to one of the rooms. The existing occupant of the room could either accept his new chum, or he could offer to pay the chum out. That's to say, he could pay him 5 shillings a week, and the new prisoner would go to another room and rent a space in that room. Therefore, the richer prisoners like Mr. Pickwick had rooms to themselves, while the poorer ones had to sleep 8 or 9 to a room. In the Fleet, the system seems to have been fair, with newcomers being allocated to rooms in strict rotation. It was very different than the King's Bench, where there was widespread abuses. Some of the turnkeys and waiters at the coffee houses held rooms in the prison, which they let out to prisoners. One, Master Gore, a debtor, had acquired sole use of a room, which he let out while he lived outside the prison in the Rules. Mr. Pickwick's horrified response to show him with 3 other men, including a butcher, represents one view of life in a debtor's prison. It has been argued that there were a very real effort by the wealthier debtors to ensure that the social life and distinctions outside the prison were replicated within the prisons. The distinction of gentility, fortune and class, which they'd obtained outside, were exactly the same within the prison. In 1814, debtors in Newgate complained about persons of the first respectability, whose walk-in life exempted them from the depraved associates, and with whom association would greatly add to the pain and punishment of confinement. Little Dorrit is full of examples of this. There's a very famous scene where Mr. Dorrit is deeply offended by a plasterer who offers him halfpenny coins. This is what Dickens writes. He says, "It ain't much," said the plasterer, putting a little pile of halfpennies in his hand, "but it's well meant, Mr. Dorrit." The father of the Marshalsea had never been offered tribute in copper yet. His children often had, and with his perfect acquiescence, it had gone into the common purse to buy meat that had been eaten and drink that he'd drunk. But fustian, splashed with white lime, bestowing halfpence on him, front to front was new. "How dare you," he said to the man, and feebly burst into tears. The plasterer turned him towards the wall that his face might not be seen, and the action was so delicate that the man was so penetrated with repentance, and he asked pardon so honestly that you could make him no less acknowledgment than that, "I know you meant it kindly, say no more." "Bless your soul, sir," urged the plasterer, "I did indeed. I do more by you than the rest of them, I do fancy." "What would you do?" he asked. "I'll come back and see you after I'm let out." "Give me the money again," said the other eagerly, "and I'll keep it and never spend it. Thank you for it, thank you. I shall see you again. If I live a week, you shall." Dorrit spends a lot of time maintaining his status and social position, constantly reminding Amy that he's a gentleman. There was a different view set out in Dickens, where the gradual exposure to poverty and despair did much to erode social distinctions within prisons. So how many do you think would have been in the Marshalsea prison on any one day, say in the 1820s? How many prisoners do you imagine might be in? Anyone any idea?
You said 83 rooms.
56 rooms.
56.
Yeah.
The challenge of 3 per room, that's what, 59-ish? 159-ish, but then obviously they're going to have a few more.
Yeah.
200. Yeah. And then you've got visitors as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Prisons, I'm thinking in particular, it varied. Anything between 80 and 120. The Marshalsea is one of the smallest prisons in London for debtors, actually. The other prisons have far more. There's roughly 2,000 prisoners in London prisons who were debtors any year in the 19th century, which was a significant number. So the Marshalsea had between 80 and 120 prisoners on any one day in the 1820s. Yet there were very few staff in this or the other debtor prisons. The King's Bench had a marshal, a deputy marshal, 3 or 4 turnkeys, a clerk of the papers, and some tipstaffs who took people to and from court. Their only real role was to prevent escapes. Dickens talks about it in some of his books, and there was also the fact they had to know who the prisoners were. This was a real problem because you had hordes of people coming in and out of these prisons. You had lawyers, you had the family, the relatives, like Charles, coming in to have their supper on a regular basis. If you've seen the film Little Dorrit or read the book, Dickens talks about hordes of people, often very bedraggled, wearing second-hand clothes or third-hand clothes, coming in and going out again. So if you were worked in there, if you were a jailer, if you like, how on earth did you know who the prisoners were? Anyone any idea?
Depends on if they paid to get out.
Well, Dickens describes it really, really well, actually, because what happened was, every time a new prisoner came in, they sat down in front of the rest of the prison officers, so they actually see what they look like, and they would sketch them. Do a sketch of them so they knew what they looked like. This is pre-photography, of course. Have a sketch so you have familiar with what the prisoner looked like. Otherwise, how the hell are you going to know? Because this person just walk out of the prison, couldn't they? Have no idea. But their main job was to stop people escaping, and they needed to know who they were dealing with. So here we have a picture here of Mr. Pickwick being observed by the other prison officials. They know what he looks like. John Dickens sat for his portrait, as did Mr. Pickwick. All the officials of the prison are looking at him here, so they remember what he looks like, in case he tries to escape. Now, so life inside the prison was largely regulated not by the employees or the people who creamed off the money from the prisoners, but by the prisoners themselves. In the King's Bench and the Marshalsea in the 18th century, there were two elected bodies, as were in the early 19th century. One was the Common side and one was the Master's side. They tried to keep order. They would arbitrate if there were quarrels between prisoners. And they were in the Master's College. They supervised the letting of rooms, the cleaning they supervised, they organised. They even enforced weights and measures in the shops in the prisons. John Dickens was elected to the Master's Side College. Now, he was there for just over 3 months. Not only did he become a member of that, he became its chairman before he left. And his son describes a similar fellowship in Little Dorrit, with Mr. Dorrit rising to become chair of the college. John Dickens managed reasonably well in the Marshalsea once his family was around him. He was still able, believe it or not, to receive his naval salary. You might ask how? He's in prison. Well, the salary was paid quarterly. He was able to send in sick notes, which they believed. Sick. He was in prison for 3 months. I suppose it wasn't that long, really, and you know, he was so his leave of absence, really. And John Forster, who wrote a wonderful life of Charles Dickens, published in the 1870s, wrote, "They had no want of bodily comforts there. His father's income, still going on, was amply sufficient for that. And what they didn't have was elbow room, I've heard say. The family lived more comfortably in prison than they had for a long time out of it. Most of all, they were free from creditors, from the loud knocking at the street door, the abuse shouted up at them from the pavement for all the neighbours to hear." Little Dorrit was born in the Marshalsea, and her mother was attended by the drunken and shabby doctor, one of the prisoners. This is not a piece of fiction, in that the Fleet prison had no medical staff. When prisoners did give birth, they would invariably use a fellow prisoner or a doctor who had been incarcerated for debt to assist with the birth, or to assist if they were ill, because there were no medical people at all in the prisons to look after the prisoners. Rather an oversight when you think they owed money to people, but anyhow, that's how things was. There is Amy Dorrit, who again visited her father on a regular basis, every day, like Charles did his father, to see where the idea for that came from. Quite large numbers of people were imprisoned for debt. On one day in 1826, there were 2,861 people in debtors' prisons, of whom 1,700 were in the 4 main London prisons: the Fleet, the Marshalsea, King's Bench and Whitecross Street Prison. Most were like Mr. Micawber and Mr. Pickwick, in that they stayed in jail for a very short time. Most for less than 6 months. There were a few unfortunates, like Mr. Dorrit, who stayed in prison for years and years and years. The debtors seemed mostly to have come from the ranks of small tradesmen. The prisoners in Whitecross Street Prison in 1826 included a hat maker, a shoemaker, a milkman, a confectioner, a horse dealer, a printer, an oyster shopkeeper, 8 labourers, a poor widow and a half-pay sea captain. A few were well-known people who found their way into debtors' prisons. Sheridan, the playwright, was under arrest for debt in 1814. William Hogarth's father was in prison for debt, but the most famous of the inmate of the King's Bench in the early 19th century was this man. Anyone recognise him?
Wellington?
No, Wellington, no. Lord Cochrane. Lord Cochrane, so he sat in the House of Lords. He was a naval hero. He had become involved in a stock exchange fraud in 1814, and as a result, he was imprisoned in the King's Bench because he owed a lot of money. And one day he acquired some rope, and he climbed over one wall to another, and he escaped. And he escaped on Monday the 6th of March, and not one single member of staff noticed that Lord Cochrane was missing. Absolutely gone. And the fun thing was, the following day, a group of MPs were inspecting the prison. This was all part of the prison reform, the committee set up by the House of Commons to reform prison facilities and reform the pay, etc. And they thought, well, let's go and find our friend Lord Cochrane, see how he is. We know he's there. And they knocked on his door. Open the door, no answer. Oh dear, but no Lord Cochrane. A complete nightmare for the government, of course, who had no idea that Cochrane had escaped. Eventually, Cochrane gave himself up and paid his debts and went to live in Chile. One of the other alternatives to going to prison, to a debtor's prison, if you had enough money, was to escape to the continent. And there were many slightly more wealthy debtors who fled abroad, particularly to Boulogne. In 1857, apparently, there were 7,000 Englishmen living in Boulogne, about a quarter of the town's population. Of course, many of these were escaping from their creditors back home in England. Escapes from the new Marshalsea prison, with its robust buildings and high walls, were actually quite rare. The routes to freedom were really through due legal process, particularly through what's called the insolvent debtor route. During John Dickens' 14 weeks of imprisonment in the Marshalsea, 142 prisoners were brought into the prison and 138 were discharged. And of these, 52 settled with their creditors. Another 59, including John Dickens, took advantage of the provision of what was the 1824 Insolvent Debtors Act. So this new act was passed the year in which John Dickens was in prison, and it was through this act that John Dickens gained his freedom. What happened was there was a schedule drawn of all the debts he owed, a list of who the creditors were, and this was sworn to. And his name was then posted in a notice in the London Gazette, alerting any other creditors to the fact he was going to be released from prison so they could come forward and declare if he also owed them money, so a complete list could be compiled. And John decided to take benefit from this act, and of course there was legal expenses, there were court costs and prison fees, all had to be paid. And so they would look at all his possessions, his income, and all that went to his creditors. But he was lucky because his mother died on the 26th of April 1824 and he was left £450. That went a long way to help him pay off his debts. So under the Insolvent Creditors Act, Debtors Act, John Dickens was able to retain for his own use, that of his family, cash, clothing and domestic necessities to the value of £20. This was equivalent to 3 weeks of his salary. There was an independent evaluation to satisfy his creditors, and nothing should have been held back. They even interviewed young Charles, who was very worried that they were going to take his lovely pocket watch from him. They allowed him to keep his pocket watch, which he wrote about as when he was much older. So John Dickens was released from the Marshalsea prison on the 28th of May 1824. He was certainly not accompanied by the cheering crowds like Mr. Dorrit was. In this illustration, the father of the Marshalsea, he'd been greatly respected by the inhabitants of the prison, and he was released to great acclamation. John Dickens had been in prison for just over 3 months, whereas the fictional Mr. Dorrit had been in the Marshalsea for over 20 years. Now, what happened afterwards? Well, Dickens was released, and he remained in the pay of the Navy, but not for long, because, the following year, in March 1825, he retired at the grand old age of 39. And he had a pension of £146 a year, but was that enough for him? No. He got a job as a reporter to supplement his income, his pension, and but even this wasn't enough to keep him out, keep the creditors away from him. In 1834 and 1835, he was arrested for debt, and Charles was able to assist him again and get him out of prison. So Dickens had a lifetime of money worries. He was a great concern for his father, and at one time Charles said to all these people who wrote to him, asking him to help his father, "No, I'll have nothing to do with you at all. I'm not going to keep meeting his debts," because he was constantly incurring these debts. He wasn't a well man, was John Dickens. He had various bladder problems. Underwent a bladder operation in 1851, and a few days later, in his 66th year, he died, 1851. So, of course, that was the end of the debts. But what about imprisonment for debt? Well, in the 19th century, in his John Dickens, an older man, it was obvious to some that imprisonment for debt was really quite pointless. And there was a series of insolvent debtors acts which allowed increasing numbers of debtors to prisoners to be released after short periods. The cost to the public of maintaining these people in prison was significant. Although many had to pay themselves, those who were poor, they were a considerable cost to the government. Imprisonment for debt was finally abolished in 1869, ending centuries of misery under the Debtors Act. Although debtors had the means to pay their debt and didn't do so, they could still be incarcerated. And up to 6 weeks they could. Initially, there was a significant reduction in the number of people who were imprisoned for debt, and by 1870 the total number of prisoners had decreased by almost 2,000 following the 1869 Act. But what happened to the prisons themselves? These enormous buildings, many built early in the 19th century during the Napoleonic Wars, what happened to them? Well, the Fleet prison closed in 1844 and was demolished 2 years later, whilst the King's Bench closed and was demolished in the 1870s. Whitecross Street prison, built 1813 to 15 to ease overcrowding at Newgate prison, the prisoners was closed in 1870. All the prisoners were transferred to the newly built Holloway prison. The Marshalsea closed in 1842, and the inmates were relocated to the nearby Queen's prison or the Bethlem Hospital in St George's Fields if they were mentally ill. Some of the prison buildings were used as lodgings for poor and needy families, and a hardware firm, George Harding & Co., established its warehouses within some of the Marshalsea buildings. By the 1890s, some of the buildings had been knocked down, the prison walls had already been lowered, and it wasn't until the mid-19th century that the surviving buildings were finally demolished in the Marshalsea, all bar a small bit, which we'll see in a moment. What about Dickens himself? Well, he finished Little Dorrit in May 1857. He then went on what was a very painful yet nostalgic trip back to the Marshalsea. What he saw, he describes in the preface of his book. This is what he writes. He says, "Whosoever goes into Marshalsea Place, turning out of Angel Court, leading to Bermondsey, will find his feet on the very paving stones of the extinct Marshalsea jail. He will see its narrow yard to the right and to the left, very little altered, if at all, except that the walls were lowered when the place got free, will look upon the rooms in which the debtors lived, and will stand among crowding ghosts of so many miserable years." And today, you can still walk down Angel Court and follow Dickens' footsteps. That's the remaining wall of the Marshalsea and part of the gatehouse. These are the only surviving relics of the Marshalsea Debtors Prison. Across the road, though, is something quite interesting. A memorial there to Little Dorrit, a resident who was not a prisoner. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
So any questions? Have a go at answering any, yes.
I was just saying, you going to the Marshalsea, recommended you go to the wall out around the corner on Nebraska Street afterwards. Bring a fine bit.
Tap refreshment.
Thank you. Was this situation replicated in other cities throughout the country? Or was it a London-specific thing?
There were far more prisons in London for them, but other cities did have debtors' prisons. There were not as many, but there were debtors' prisons in, say, York, for example. I know there were other ones in Scotland, but London had the biggest concentration of debtors in prisons and specific debtors' prisons.
Are any of them particularly documented either in fiction or...
Certainly
I've
not,
never heard of any of the prisons elsewhere.
No, certainly not by Dickens. I mean, I'm not sure how many there would have been in Lincoln prison. There were debtors there.
This is how it's still here.
But it's not an area I've looked at, particularly all the other cities. It's something maybe you search probably with someone here to have a look at them, because it's a fascinating subject. How many there were in other prisons across the country would be interesting, but not the volume as there were in London. Thank you. Good question. Yes.
Yeah. The Fleet prison, before they were finished by Dickinson, but there was known of Fleet marriages. How did that work out with the debts? Was this done for dodgy priests and things could reside within the Fleet area? And basically, if you want to get married to someone who has married before, or your parents didn't approve, or anyone, and go to Britain and agree, you could just trot off to the Fleet and find a priest who gave him his palm, and he would marry you, and it was perfectly legal. Was this part of the debtors thing, or was it? How did this link
If
in
that
with
priest was actually a debtor, which some of them were, like some of the doctors were, and people, they carried on their profession inside the prison, they would have done outside the prison. They could come and go to some extent as well, provided they often returned in the evening, or less they lived out in the rules, so they could marry people. Just like if you were a midwife, you could deliver children within the prison. So that went on. So you were a civilian in prison, you weren't a criminal. So a lot of it was quite lax in a way. Yeah. Yeah. So.
What would happen to anyone who tried to escape and then was caught and then brought back? Would there be any sort of punishment or anything like that for trying to escape?
They did have, in the Marshalsea, they had a very secure cell in the middle, which was built primarily for people who had been in the Navy, who had committed misdemeanours and crimes, right in the middle of the prison. And that was used. It wasn't always occupied. They could put people in there. But the key thing was they were desperate to get the money out of these prisoners. So if you treat them too severely, they may well not succeed. But that did happen. Yes, there could have been a sanction. But the number of escapes was very, very small, in fact. Very small, interestingly enough. Anyone else? Anybody else?
I
Kate?
kind of don't understand where they were expected to get the money from for paying for all the things like the room for the harm while they were in there, if they're being put in there because they owe money.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously Charles Dickens' father
Yeah.
is just on the sick note and getting money by that.
Yeah.
But many of the others wouldn't have had that luxury, especially if they were sort of self-employed tradespersons.
That's right.
So they're already owing money.
Yeah.
They're sent to
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
be incarcerated,
Yeah.
where they've then got to pay more money for
Yeah.
their keep. Where are they expected to get it from?
They got 3 shillings and 6 months if you're a poor prisoner.
Yeah, I know. I remember you saying the 3 shillings a week,
Yeah.
but surely that wouldn't have been enough
No.
to cover, beer night, wine night, Skittles night.
There were several charities which set up in the 18th century where they helped prisoners, particularly poorer prisoners, okay? But there were some who simply didn't. The debts mounted and mounted and mounted, and they stayed in prison for a very, very long
Is that
time.
why, I mean, I forget, it's a long time since I read it. Is that why little Dorrit's father is permanently in there? Because he's just accruing debts, or is it also
There was
because,
more to it than that, actually.
or is it
to
just
do.
because he's a bit feckless?
There's a bit more to it, but yeah. That's not uncommon, but most people in there for a short time, they did manage to scrape together the money, or they agreed under the sort of Debtors Act that they would be released and they would have a schedule of repayment, and that was obviously a very
Creditors
positive.
agreed to it.
If they agreed to it, absolutely. And some before those acts still agreed, and they negotiated with their creditors to repay them. So they didn't want to be in prison. It wasn't fun being in prison. Although you were away from your creditors in a way, and you weren't being hounded by them, it still wasn't much fun being in a small room, even if you've got your family there. It wasn't great fun. You lost your
It
freedom.
still doesn't
etc.
make much sense to me. Put in prison when, say they've still got a job, still they can still work, but it prevents them from going to work so that they can at least earn a bit more money.
Well, absolutely. As I said at the beginning, it's in a way it's partly illogical because they can't repay their debts. They're not working to do it. So the idea was, I think, to force the families and friends to cough up so they didn't go to prison and the creditors would get paid. And it didn't always work, as we know. There wouldn't have been thousands of people in debtors' prisons every year in the 19th century. But it's a very interesting, I think, theme and subject. And it's fascinating the way Dickens actually covers it in so many of his books in different ways. It had a profound psychological effect on him as a 12-year-old. It must have been taken away from your mother and your father, sent to work in a blacking factory, living in rented accommodation in a room north of the river, separated. I mean, how would you feel as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old? How would you feel? It must have been awful for him. So clearly, it comes out in his works.
Yeah, just a quick one. I don't know how much you know the 1834 Border Amendment Act, which is
these stuff.
Yes.
So parishioners and people who run those poor law boards, do you know how much information is for the talk to people who run these sort of justice prisons, and whether there's an inclination to apply the methods that have in the workhouse, which I think we talked about, to the same degree they'll treat these people? Because obviously having no money or being poor is not seen as a social disgrace. So is being, I've seen poor as well, being not being able to work. So do you agree on that?
It's not an area I've looked at. Prisons. It's a very good point. I have to look far more at the regimes in the prisons. But again, what they have in the workhouse is the way it's regulated. Well, they're working, they're being useful. And in the prison, in a way, people are continuing their trades, they're continuing to be useful and contributing to a way. And even people who are very poor prisoners, they might be making dolls, they're making things to sell, and they are trying to earn a bit of money to keep themselves fed, basically, because it was the 3 and 6 didn't go very far in the prison. Particularly if you enjoyed having a few drinks, and go to the tap room, and or a coffee house, whatever. It was a way to spend your money and line the pockets of the tip staff and various other people in the working in the prison. Thanks for the point.
Some of the prisoners learn new skills, like coping skills, or anything like that.
I don't think that's officially a regime set up like that. I don't think that well organised. I think that came later.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to be corrected on that. I don't think there were so few staff. I don't think they were teaching people things. Other prisons may have taught people things informally,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's certainly not like it is today, where you actually can do a degree in prison. It's nothing like that then.
Yeah.
It's very, very rudimentary. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah.
Thank you.